Everybody, this is Tom Salemi. Welcome back to Device Talks Tuesdays. Have a snowy Device Talks Tuesday here up in Boston. But fortunately, we're inside and we're watching a great webinar brought to you by our friends at HP. You can see the title right there, How Effective Quality Management Systems Maximize Additive Manufacturing Medical Device Production. So I will go through my little intro as I normally do. This is a virtual event that is available for watching at any time. So if you know a colleague or a friend or a relative or anyone in your life who would enjoy this conversation, let them know they can watch it. They can register sometime after noon tomorrow at devicetalks.com. They can watch the entire presentation. They can even ask questions, and we'll make sure they're sent directly to HP. So this is an ongoing, interactive sort of production that has a very long shelf life. So we hope you will tell your friends again to take advantage of it. The slides that we'll be showing today are available to you in the resource widget, so check it out. We will be taking questions throughout, so please submit as they come to mind. Don't wait until the end. If you have a question that comes to mind right away, plug it in there. If we can get to it right away, we will. If we can't, then we'll get to it at the end, but it's always helpful to know that how many questions are in the queue. So again, ask the questions as they come to mind. And finally, if you're using social media, please use hashtag DeviceTalksTuesdays. All right, once again, we are meeting in person again. We'll be in Boston May 10th and 11th at the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center. Go to devicetalks.com for more information there. And while you're there, check out our family of podcasts, which includes our flagship Device Talks weekly podcast, Intuitive Talks, Stryker Talks, Medtronic Talks. These are all available on every major podcast player. You can look for Device Talks or Medtronic Talks. They have their own channels. And we'll be rolling out our Boston Scientific Talks podcast next month. Yeah, it's still February, so next month. So make sure you check that out. But let's get back to the topic at hand. I'd like to thank our sponsor, HP, for putting this great conversation together. And I'm actually going to be handing over controls to David Johnson. David's an application engineer at HP, and he'll be speaking with Erik Boelen, who is consultant medical at 3D printing Case 3D. So, David, I believe this is where you take over.
All right, Tom, appreciate the introduction. So, everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time, we have been doing these webinars more geared towards medical 3D printing segments. So if you are interested, we have prior ones that we've done with Device Talk Tuesdays. We also have a few HP that are recorded. So if this is the first time joining us, please take a look at those as well. But my name is David Johnson. I am an application engineer for HP, covering our multi-jet fusion technology, which is our thermoplastic powder process. We also do have a metal technology that is newer to the market. I've been with HP for about 2 years, coming up in a little bit, based out of Milwaukee. As of today, since I'm on the road, I'm currently doing this in Minneapolis. But I'm very, very excited for this conversation. The QMS has been a very big open topic with not a lot of very clear guidance. So our goal at HP is to help our customers, user base, those interested in getting into the process of what we're seeing our customers do, what we're seeing people like Erik do, and try to really bring a lot of value to and assistance to helping you build your business. And the goal of HP is to have actual production manufacturing capability utilizing our technology. And when that comes to fruition in medical, that there is a lot of processes you have to be aware of, and QMS is a very important one. So Erik, very excited to have you here today. I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what else we can expect about the webinar today.
All right, thank you, David. Yeah, so my name is Erik Boelen. I am a biomedical engineer at heart. After my PhD, I started in 3D printing, and I've spent more than 15 years of my career in 3D printing of medical devices. I'm passionate about medical 3D printing, And currently I have my own business as a consultant, and I help companies build their quality management system with a focus on companies that use additive manufacturing to produce their medical devices.
All right, well, very exciting. We have a lot of topics to cover, and as Tom said, if you do have any questions, please ask them as we go through our conversation. I will do my best to review those, and if we're able to cover it as we're going through the slide or topic, we'll bring it up at that moment. One thing we do like to do, just because every audience we get is a little bit different. Sorry. Just to get a general idea of our audience, especially when it comes to the QMS system, because this is a conversation we don't get a lot of initial feedback, but just wanting to see how you can rate your own company's QMS system. So when it comes to that, a strong one, you're doing a very established process. You currently have a QMS system, but you definitely need to go through improvements, just starting out, brand new to it, or you currently have no QMS. So this will help gauge kind of the conversation with Erik and I, just to give an idea of certain areas we might need to cover a little bit in more detail too. So give that a little bit.
I'm going to, yeah, here we go.
There we go. Okay, so give it a few more seconds, but it looks like there's definitely QMS needs improvement. Currently none at all, so I think this is a good area to cover, and a applaud to those that have a strong QMS. I know it's a lot of work and definitely worthwhile. All right, so Erik, I will let you take it from here and kind of go through, you know, your initial approach when you work with customers for the first time, you know, talking about quality, and just would like to understand what those conversations typically look like.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, in general, especially in the field of additive manufacturing for medical devices, if we're talking about quality and quality management, I always feel it's important to elaborate on the definition of quality, because it seems that a lot of people are more focused only on the manufacturing side of the business, whereas in terms of quality, you have to be in control of all your company's processes. So the definition I chose here is to be in control of your processes so you can consistently meet customer requirements and the applicable regulatory requirements. So that covers every process in your company, and not just the additive manufacturing process, which is of course the topic of today as well. But we thought it was important to show also that it is a lot more than just the additive manufacturing side of things. A lot of times I speak to clients who think, well, who are mainly struggling with controlling their additive manufacturing process. But as I say, as you see here, it's much more than that. It's also much more than case management than traceability. For example, as part of quality management, you have to control your suppliers. You have to train your employees. You have to ensure that you have proper resources. You have to make sure that you, as a company, learn from your mistakes and continuously improve. the processes in your company. You have to verify and validate your processes. So there's a lot more to quality than just controlling the additive manufacturing part.
What's a surprising aspect of the quality control that your customers usually find out about or didn't really think is a part of the quality management system?
Yeah, well, as I said, a lot of times when people are starting to think about quality management system, it's more, they mostly think it has to do with controlling the manufacturing side of things. But actually looking at your whole business, your business as a whole, yeah, you're going to see that if you grasp all that and if you document all that, that there's a lot of room for other improvements that make your company more efficient and more cost effective maybe.
Gotcha. So as we can kind of move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so if you want to be in control of all these things inside your company, this is where the quality management system comes in. Obviously the topic for today. So quality management system, as said, is quite broad. It's quite generic. Basically, what you have to do in a quality management system is that you document what your company is doing and how you're doing it. And it's typically also a risk-based process where you look at all the processes in your company, and the ones with the higher risk obviously require either more inspection, measurements to verify, validation, training, those kind of things, just to mitigate the risk that you see in the processes in your company. And also, as part of a QMS, you have to record proof that you actually do as you have documented that you're doing. So if you say you're doing certain things, you have to be able to prove it with certain records. So for example, proof of training, seeing that your employees have received proper training on aspects that are relevant to their part of the business. If you're doing certain measurements, you have to be able to show these measurements. You have to record them somewhere. You have to find them again. Income checks, if you are purchasing stuff from critical suppliers, then you probably want to do some checks when the parts are coming in or when the materials coming in. These checks have to be recorded as well, so you can always prove that you have done them. CAPAs are a special category in the QMS. It stands for corrective and preventive actions. So in every business, at some point, something will go wrong. You document that, you analyze why it went wrong, and you take action on to improve it. Or indeed, and with the preventive action, you look at how you can prevent these kind of things happening in the future. Feedback is also very valuable to document feedback from your customers. So this is all stuff that you want to record, which is documented proof that your quality system works. I know that documentation to a lot of employees, it feels often as a lot of bureaucracy, so to say. But I think that depends a bit on the rigidity of the chosen document management system. But in any event, if you have something that went wrong in your company and you want to analyze the causes, you will always find that you didn't even record enough. So it's always valuable to record a lot of stuff that you're doing, so it helps you later on to say, okay, this is everything I did, this is what I recorded, which helps you finding potential causes of non-conformities later on.
Yeah, and I think the biggest headache I've always heard about is the documentation process, as I've watched a handful of customers go through developing their own or revamping it. When it comes to the documentation, because additive is a digital process for the most part, working with digital files into actual physical production, how does that documentation differ with like a digital versus paper process? Because a lot of customers might have a paper process for their other conventional manufacturing, and now they're kind of having a more digital approach to it. Is there a balance that they're seeing, or how do you approach that with your customers?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of digital records, so to say. I think paper is, we'll see that also in the next slide. Paper is difficult to control, as you will, as we're talking about controlling your processes. So I'll come back to that in a bit. Although indeed, I do agree that at some points, paper is hard to avoid. It's not always easy for all your employees anywhere to go into a computer or an iPad to record stuff. Sometimes when you're working, for example, cleaning a device and you want to record some things, it's best done. It's the easiest for the employee also to do that on paper. So indeed, sometimes it can't be avoided, but I would definitely recommend to digitize as much as practically possible.
And then when it comes, this is a question that isn't a straight answer, but understanding how you work with your customers, I think would be helpful. The risk-based approach with how in-depth you need to go for your QMS, how do you see that balance? Just because there's, it's not like a low risks, you do XYZ, medium, you do XYZ. How do you see that? Because it's, based on the product, but some of the inspection and measurements, and there's not really a well-developed foundation when it comes to additive manufacturing. How do you approach that as far as like, if a company is doing enough for their risk basis, or maybe they're doing too much for their risk basis? How do those conversations look like?
Well, I think the regulator would say you're never doing too much, but no, it's actually it's a risk-based system, so you have to analyze your risk, and actually that's a responsibility of the manufacturer to reduce the risks. We are producing medical devices which should help patients in the end. So the risk has to be as low as possible. So manufacturers have to perform risk analysis, perform residual risk evaluation, but also do a risk-benefit analysis. And sometimes a part is risky, but if it has tremendous benefit to a patient, it's still okay to use it. But there is no one actually telling you, no, you have to reduce even further. It's your own responsibility as a manufacturer. You have to also, there is another ISO standard for that. It's the ISO 14971, which is about risk management. And they speak about an as low as reasonably practicable approach. So you have, as part of your risk analysis, you have to mitigate your risk as low as reasonably practical. So yeah, there is no solid answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the answer I always tell people is just, it depends. There's always a lot at play. So I appreciate the feedback on that question. One more question, and I think we can move on to the next slide. As far as the like inspection, measurements, supply checks, how does a manufacturer determine what that best method, or maybe their specific testing that makes more sense for their process versus what is traditionally done? What's a good way for a manufacturer to kind of evaluate all the different options and say this seems to be the best fit for how we're producing this part?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to determine the kind of measurements that should basically be an outcome also of your risk analysis. One thing, for example, if you introduce visual inspection of the part, which is something quite straightforward, it already helps to increase awareness amongst the employees that they're not just pushing it to the next process, but if you're inspecting it and you're seeing that, oh, it looks different than normal, it's already, it generates kind of awareness. If you are opting for dimensional measurements, for example, you can either use a caliper or you could perform optical scanning. And it really depends on where the risk is in the part deviating or whatever. And depends on the size and the complexity and the tolerances of the part, which type of measurement is suitable. Can you just go with the caliper, or do you really have to perform an optical measurement? So actually the manufacturer is free to decide how he wants to mitigate his risk, how he wants to do his measurements, as long as he can prove that he's in control of the whole process.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it does. And we do have a question. I think this is a good point to cover it. So it's as a startup company, it's difficult to balance between doing a QMS versus evolving your product or the process. How is there like a discussion or decision on that balance for a fast-growing company?
I know that a lot of startup companies, for most companies actually, QMS is a big hurdle. It's a big thing to implement. I think if you just start documenting most of what you do, then you're already halfway there. Basically creating the records that you need as proof that you have done certain things. And I see most companies, they already have a lot of instructions. We'll see that in a bit also, that as part of a quality management system, you have different levels of documentation, and instructions are tier 3, I think you call it in the US. And a lot of companies have that already. They have just instructions on how to do certain things within their company. So that is already there, and usually what is lacking is the more high-level procedures on that basically say what your company is doing. And that's the difference in a documented quality management system. You have basically procedures describing what you do, and you have instructions describing how you do it. So, and I think those are actually the bulk. But I don't know if it's a good answer to this question. But yeah, you have to start somewhere. And best advice I can give is have as much documented as possible in a structured way that you can easily find it again later.
Yeah, working for a startup in a prior company, I definitely understand the difficulty of that balance. One thing I do want to add, because I think it is important as you start looking at QMS and how to do it, the companies that have the strongest QMS, at least from HP's MJF user base, typically have the best performing printers. And that can be as far as it's well maintained, so they don't have as much downtime. Their yield or like successful parts that come out are increased. So there is a lot of benefits from having a strong QMS as far as like cost savings, time savings, because you're having a better precision process in general, and therefore you're able to see what changes are actually affecting parts. And if you're able to control those things, it also makes experimentation easy. That was a very big challenge companies I worked for, is you might change one thing to help improve your process, but if you're not controlling all the other levers at play, you're not really sure if the results are valid or not. So that's I think a big challenge, and having a strong QMS makes those processes and tasks a lot easier to validate results and also get better throughput, because you're typically a very lean team. So having to redo things over and over just is a very big issue with bandwidth for your team.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the end, the quality management system should be something that supports your company. And as I said in the beginning, a lot of people see it as a bureaucratic hurdle, but in the end, it should be something that really helps people in their day-to-day job. And as you already said, if you have a strong QMS and you document everything, then sometimes you see in a company that a certain error arises multiple times, and at one time someone fixes it, and at some other time someone else fixes it. But if there's no record, people have to basically find out how to fix that error themselves. Whereas if you have a record and say, oh, that error actually happened before, then it's easier solved, and best even would be to prevent it from happening. And that's where QMS can actually be of benefit, obviously, to an organization.
All right, so currently no open questions, so I think we can move on to the next slide.
Okay. So if we're talking about the quality management system, there is a standard, which is called ISO 13485, which is a international standard that basically lists the requirements of a quality management system for medical devices. And the standard is very generic. It's true for the whole medical devices industry, regardless of how you're manufacturing. Even if you're casting, or if you're milling, or if you're additively manufacturing your parts, that doesn't matter, because as we saw, the quality management system is more than just the production. Production is just one small chapter of the whole ISO standard. I think one of the more famous or maybe infamous requirements is actually document control. So you will need to be in control of your documentation. And that's why I think you need a digital document management system, as paper cannot really be controlled, as we already touched on briefly, because a piece of paper doesn't tell you that when it's outdated and there's a newer version available. And that's important in a documented system, that you're always looking at the latest version and you're not looking at an older version. And in a digital system, that is usually an out-of-the-box feature, that you're looking at the latest version of a certain document. But if you find a document on paper, how do you know that it's actually the latest version? So, and also paper is not always available at point of use. I've seen many quality systems that are just bundled together in the management office somewhere, where actually it needs to be available, which is a requirement at the point of use. And there also a digital system obviously comes in. And it doesn't really need to be an expensive system. Documents in the quality management system, they need to be reviewed, they need to be approved. You need to keep versioning. Personally, I used kind of a wiki system to build my QMS. Works like a charm. It's very affordable. So it really doesn't need to be a expensive dedicated system. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that obviously maybe most of your attendees today are from the United States. So ISO 13485 is an international standard, but in the US, obviously you have to deal with the FDA. Their 21 CFR 820, I believe, is that's the quality system regulation in the US. But I've read recently that they are inclined to move towards ISO 13485. So so this is today's webinar is also applicable for people in the US.
Yeah, so Erik, on that shift, I know it was announced last year that they're looking to lean just for more international compliance. Do you know what the biggest difference is between what the FDA requires with the 21 CFR 820? Like if there's any major differences between that and the ISO 13485?
Yeah, well, the FDA is your regulatory body. So what the FDA says is the law. So they have regulatory requirements, whereas ISO is a standard. It's a voluntary standard. The law, the FDA is the law, so it's mandatory for manufacturers selling devices in the United States. But the requirements in both ISO 13485 and 21 CFR 820 are actually very, very similar. I think the main difference would be that ISO 13485 is a risk-based quality management system, and with risk-based, I mean the entire system is risk-based, whereas I think for the FDA, the analysis of risk is just one requirement in the entire system. So I think that was the main difference between the two. And all the other requirements are actually really, really similar.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so if you were thinking of starting building your quality management system, my advice would be to read the standard. And yeah, I know it's not the best reading material, so you might want to read it a few more times. But as you read it, and I did it as well, initially it starts to make sense. You are reading things that you're like, ah, yeah, but we are doing that already. We didn't really document it yet, but so you will see that a lot of the requirements that are in there are probably already covered in one way or another. So just read it to understand what they're actually saying and what they actually want you to do. Analyze your risks in the company. So perform risk analysis on your processes and mitigate them. Also, you have to be aware of regulatory requirements. They did that quite, how do you say, it's sneaky. As I said before, that ISO 13485 is a voluntary standard, but one of the requirements in the standard is that you have to be also compliant with all the applicable regulatory requirements. So basically, ISO has a lot of requirements in terms of QMS, but they also say you also have to conform to the regulatory requirements. So be aware of that. And something else, management commitment is actually a requirement of ISO 13485. So what I'm meaning to say here is that you cannot pay a consultant or anyone to build the QMS for you. You do have to put in the work yourself. Someone else cannot build the, as a consultant, obviously, we can help and we can help make sense of it all. But it's your company, you understand the processes. So management has to be committed to the quality system and has to put in the effort.
All right. Well, I do have a few questions, especially because I think one of the reasons I was excited that you were able to join us today is you have a very unique perspective that you've actually built a QMS from scratch with a prior company that you worked for. You're very focused on the medical production 3D printing side, and then now you're in a consulting role working with smaller companies that were going through that same process. With you actually creating the system when you worked at the company, I know you talked a little bit about setting up your wiki page to kind of deal with some of the documentations. Can you go a little bit into some of the other things that might have been like a challenge or things that you weren't expecting? Like maybe the time frame it took, your bandwidth that was focused to help build that, and kind of just give a little more information about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, when we, in my former company, we were making custom-made medical devices and using a lot of 3D printing in the process. So we strategically decided to go for ISO 13485 because of, in Europe, you have European regulations. CE marking, you're probably familiar with, but CE marking only applies to standard devices and not to custom made. So in Europe, that wasn't really an issue, but as soon as we're talking to people outside of Europe, everyone expects that you have a CE certificate on your product, which we didn't. So basically for us, it was a strategic decision to basically certify our processes. So with CE, you certify your product. With an ISO certificate, you certify the process, and the process is always the same. And the device that we were making was always different, but the process was the same. So we went on kind of a quest for quality, as you may, and we had some thoughts that we didn't want this bureaucratic system. We want something that was alive, that was helping our employees, and so that at the right time in the process, they were getting the right documentation. And as a startup, we didn't want it to be very expensive, of course, which is also the reason why I built it from scratch completely. It took me about 1.5 years, I would say. But right now, if I'm doing it with clients, I believe it can be done in 6 to 9 months or so. But and so for the system, we wanted something that would help our employees. We spoke to a lot of representatives of document management systems, quality management systems. But what we thought was, besides the fact that some were insanely expensive, is that they're basically file vaults. So they just take your document, your Word or your PDF, put it in a vault, and no one can basically change it unless you have to check it out. And that's not what we were looking for. So in the end, our IT manager, he basically asked us, yeah, what are you looking for? I'm the IT guy, maybe you should ask me. And we were like, indeed, maybe we should. So when we explained what we wanted to him, basically the first thing he said was, yeah, it sounds like you want some kind of a Wikipedia-like functionality, yeah? Because in Wikipedia, you also cannot publish any kind of document unless someone else has reviewed it. So it needs review, it needs approval, and it always stores the history of a certain document, which is basically all the document control requirements that are in the standard are already covered by the wiki system.
Gotcha. Is there any type, I'm not too familiar on like the wiki system, is that just like a pretty custom template, or is there like certain wiki providers that, because we did a few questions on that specifically.
Mm-hmm. Well, personally, I'm using Confluence. Don't know if anyone knows it, but it's out of the box. It's just a blank page. It's a blank canvas. It just has the functionalities of document management, and you can build your documentation structure in there. So yeah, so it's not a real system as such, which makes it much more flexible. It's not a setup structure. You have to make it yourself, so that's a bit more effort. But in the end, you'll have something that is much more flexible and customizable to your company, to what you want.
All right, well, thank you. I do want, we're getting a little close on time, so I do want to make sure we cover the last two slides and then give enough time for Q&A. So I want to move forward to the next.
Okay. Oh. Yeah, so today we are specifically speaking about additive manufacturing. And I think the reason that people are struggling basically with quality is the fact that this is a very relatively new technology, maybe not that well understood compared to milling and casting technologies. And what makes it, I think, really special is that when you're 3D printing, when you're manufacturing, you're actually changing the material while producing your part. So the final material is not the same as your starting material. You start with resin or a powder, and you end up with a solid material. And what else is not really helpful is that in terms of additive manufacturing, there are practically no ISO or ASTM standards available yet. I think there are a few in the works, but there's not that much available. So you don't have any standards to fall back on and to refer to. You basically have to figure out yourself how to control your processes. But although the QMS is very similar between companies, the actual production process in 3D printing is quite unique. And controlling that process is really posing an additional challenge to the people in our field. Although I have seen very well written guidance from the FDA. It's a document called Technical Considerations for Additive Manufactured Medical Devices. I really advise you to read that. And it covers a lot of the different, well, technical considerations you should have a look at when you're producing medical devices using additive manufacturing.
So one, in this, as we're talking about multi-jet fusion, as you mentioned, with the material, you know, the final material not being the same as the starting one, with multi-jet fusion, because we are doing powder recycling, So anywhere from 70 to 90% of a batch material is recycled, and that plays a whole new variable that, as you mentioned, doesn't really exist before. There's no really guidance as far as the FDA. How does like an example like that and other technologies have their own unique capabilities that are don't provide a lot of structure for consistency? How does a manufacturer navigate those uniqueness to additive as they're putting together a QMS and trying to make sure they're doing everything to the best of their ability?
I think testing is key. I think you have to test the parts that come out. And obviously, if you have one-off parts, you don't want to have destructive testing. So either you, and you see that also a lot, that people print additional test parts in the same build to test, or you validate the process in some way or another, that you do regular tests, maybe not in the same build, but you do those regularly. You also can get from a lot of machine manufacturers. They have also performed, usually when you're probably also HP, and the process of selling the machines, you want to support your customers, and you provide typically data on indeed mixing ratio and recycling. So you have that also as a backup, that you can see, okay, if I'm doing this the same way as HP is doing, I should be able to get these properties, but you still have to verify it for your own application. And you have to perform chemical testing and mechanical testing to make sure that, your final part and your final material is as it should be, as it can be expected.
All right, thank you. We're coming up on a few minutes left. If you want to move to the next slide, we'll quickly go over that and then cover. There are a few questions I do want to get to and make sure we have enough time for it.
Yeah, well, one thing I did want to mention also today is that, as I said before, you want to test whatever comes out of your printing process. You cannot rely on these certifications that you receive, and I see HP also provides a nice document saying, okay, we tested biocompatibility of the printed parts with our machine, with our material. This is not, you cannot rely solely on this as a manufacturer. You cannot say, look, HP tested it, I'm having the same machine, same powder, so whatever comes out of my process is biocompatible. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a pitfall, and I see a lot of people, obviously, there's a level of trust, but you still would have to validate biocompatibility yourself. And also it applies to using software. So if you're using certified software, you still want to validate that. And if you read the disclaimer of all of these certificates, it does say that it's the responsibility of each customer to determine that in the end you have something that's safe and technically suitable for your intended application, consistent with regulatory requirements, and that customers should conduct their own testing. So these certificates, they provide some kind of security and trust that, okay, this biocompatibility can be achieved, but you cannot use it as proof for your own device, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's trust but validate, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. Not only are we testing very specific criteria when we print, there's things that if you do any post-processing, do improve surface finish or paint or anything like that, those, even though our part comes out biocompatible, might negatively impact it where now it's no longer the case. So it is very important to validate as what would be the final part after all the processes are done. So it is pretty critical. So Erik, just to give enough time, and on to the next slide, what is the best way that any audience members can reach out to you? What kind of covering your consulting business, what can you help with, just so they have a better idea and like when it might make sense to reach out to yourself?
Yeah. So as introduced, I spent my entire career in 3D printed medical devices, and now I have my own consultancy business where I help mainly startups with building their QMS, or companies that already have some form of QMS but paper-based. I can help them to digitize it also. So this is how you can reach me. My email is there. The website is www.case3d.com. I think the last thing I wanted to mention is if you're making a medical device, I call it that you should do the partner or child test. So basically saying that, are you comfortable that the device that you're making is used either on your partner or on your child? And if you cannot say yes without hesitation, there's something to improve there.
That's a very good litmus test for medical production.
Yeah.
So one other reminder, just we do have a survey that if you can fill it out, as I mentioned, we've done these in the past, we will do more in the future. This helps drives our topics and just making sure we're covering our audience's perspective correctly. So please fill that out as we are going through questions. And we do have a few. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. So Erik and I will respond back on some of the ones we can't get to, but we'll probably have enough time to cover one or two. So we did get a question asking about almost like how do you test or internally audit your QMS and identify any limits or areas that might require attention and improvement?
Well, I think you put the answer in the question. You have something called audits. So as part of your quality system, you perform audits, which is basically a internal or external check that you're doing what you say you're doing. So during an audit, you have someone in your company who goes through your quality system and who speaks to people on the floor and to see if they're actually doing what is described in the system. So you try to find weak spots and errors in your own system, which is actually also a requirement again, that you continuously improve your quality management system. So you do that internally. You can also do that externally, either paying someone to do an audit of your system, or you can go to, for example, a supplier and you audit them. And if you want to have your ISO 13485 certificate, you need to pay a notified body to do an audit of your quality management system. So, and they will always find things that can be improved.
Never 100% success rate there.
No.
And then last question, how do you, the company, evaluate looking at a consultant to help with developing the QMS, or hiring or kind of engaging a current employee to focus on that? Is there a balance there that kind of makes sense for a company to consider before moving forward?
I think you should do both. You, as I said before, you cannot hire a consultant to build your entire QMS. But if you're doing it in-house by someone without expertise who has to really start from scratch, it takes a long time, and you will make mistakes that could have been avoided if you're working with a consultant. But so there should be someone internally who is responsible. There should be a management representative who will be working with a consultant in building a quality management system. So yeah, I think you need both.
Okay, well, that I think we'll wrap it up. I apologize for not getting to everyone's questions, but as I mentioned, Erik and I will reach out to you just to you get an answer from one or both of us. So just to have a quick few closing items, there will be follow-up to everyone with resources to Case 3D and other things that we've mentioned. We will have other webinars coming out this year, so please keep an eye out for them. And we do have a handful of on-demand webinars that we've done in the past, and medical regulations, biocompatibility, design for additive. And then if you are going to either AMUG or Rapid, HP will be there and have a booth. I will personally be at AMUG, so if you are attending, please stop by, introduce yourself. I'd love to chat a little bit further. And Erik, thank you so much for being a part of this. I love getting people who really have the expertise that we're looking to relay to our customer base and kind of giving their perspective on some of these topics. And Tom,
I enjoyed it.
Yes, I'm glad I did too. So Tom, you can take it from here for kind of the closing statements.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to sit back and watch. It was a great presentation, and as you said, we'll get to the questions that remain unanswered. But thanks, HP, for putting this together and for supporting Device Talks Tuesdays. Thank you all, of course, for taking part in this episode of Device Talks Tuesdays. And tune in next week. We'll have another episode waiting for you. So have a great week, everybody.